You're listening to Sports Entertainment Awareness, bringing you the best in professional wrestling coverage of WWE Raw, WWE SmackDown, WWE NXT, AEW, and backstage wrestling news.
Our mission is to bring pro wrestling further into the mainstream with weekly coverage, history, wrestling news, and opinions on the sport of professional wrestling.
I'm Josh.
I'm Jonah.
And welcome to Sports Entertainment Awareness. We're here. It's Sunday, August 18th. We don't have a lot to talk about in terms of news.
A little bit of a quiet week for the most part.
Quiet couple of weeks.
Makes sense. We got All In coming up, so I'm sure we'll have a little bit more of a breakdown next week post-show. But, yeah.
Let's talk about a couple of things I either heard or paid attention to or listened to this week, and you can throw some in too.
Shooting from the hip.
So, Undertaker says he wants another match.
Unfortunately, yes.
Unfortunately. So let's unpack that, and I just want to call out the next one, and then we'll go back to Undertaker. Jim Cornette reported that the reason we're not seeing the Young Bucks on TV after they just won the title is because Tony's holding their dates, which sounds to me like he's conserving them for later shows, or he's run out of money for them. I don't think that's a bad thing, though. No one's really complaining that we're not watching them or seeing them. How old is the Undertaker?
Early 60s.
Let's Google it.
59.
59. March 24th, 1965. He will be 60 in less than 365 days.
Oh, damn, so he just turned it.
Where did we hear that he wants to come back? Where did that come from?
He recently did an interview with Logan Paul on his podcast, Impulsive, and it came up, and Taker said it's hard being in the arena sometimes because he just gets that itch. I honestly think Undertaker is still going through a little bit of an identity crisis, which is very normal for athletes to go through when they retire because it's something you dedicated your life for 30, 40 plus years. And it's like, well, what do I do now?
Absolutely. And especially when they talk about it as a rush, being under the lights, being in the crowd, getting the reactions. He had a very special way of interacting with the crowd.
And he had a very special connection with the crowd that really nobody else in wrestling history had. Not Cena, not Hogan, not Austin. It was a very unique relationship.
There was a lot of respect and reverence.
Even to this day, there still is a little bit of a bend the knee mentality. I forget who said it. I think it may have been Mark Henry. But he said he's kind of like the godfather of wrestling. Kiss the ring.
I thought that was Papa Shango.
Either way.
I think Triple H would let him come back. I don't see why Triple H wouldn't.
I can tell you why Triple H wouldn't let him come back. Because they're roughly the same age. I think Triple H knows Undertaker better than probably very few other people. And I think he would have a very hard conversation with him, saying to him, I love you, I respect you, and I love your family. And because of that very reason, I'm not letting you in the ring.
If he comes back to wrestle, only one of two things could occur. He has a really good match with the right person, and it gives him the itch to wrestle more. The more he wrestles, the more he gives himself the opportunity to tarnish his reputation. The other option is he has a terrible match. Maybe he hurts himself. Regardless, it blows up his legacy and tarnishes it even more.
Well, and that's kind of the thing. Like, even on his Wikipedia page, he has a whole section dedicated to talking about his, like, end of his run career. And I just can't unsee Undertaker versus Roman Reigns at WrestleMania, where Roman's trying his hardest to make it work, but Taker was fat, he was slow, he was unable to move, he shouldn't have been in the ring. And that match was probably one of the worst WrestleMania events I've ever seen. And that match was bad because Undertaker was bad. It had nothing to do with Roman Reigns.
Agreed. And like I said, it could go in two ways. It could go really well. They could give him a short squash match, give him somebody else like Cena that he did that one time. Remember? You know what I'm talking about.
You could do that, but then the other thing is this. Undertaker's the type of guy, at least when it comes to wrestling, if you give him an inch, he's going to take a mile. And as soon as you give him that thing again, he's going to want more.
That's what I'm saying.
So I was thinking, like, could he be an agent? Probably not, because it would feed the itch. Could he be someone on creative? Probably not, because it would feed the itch. I think, unfortunately, his current podcast is creating an itch because he's talking about wrestling and he's talking about his past.
He would be a great on-screen personality if he didn't have to leave his house to do it, and he could just film in segments.
Well, and you could get away with that since Undertaker is just a magical space wizard, even to this day, they've kind of just combined the American Badass with the Space Wizard gimmick. He has a kind of a Space Wizard, let's be honest.
Imagine them doing a segment where they're FaceTiming with The Undertaker.
And then he just appears in the ring holding up his iPhone.
How did I get here? But I actually think the podcast is good for him, and I'll tell you why. It gives him an outlet. He seems to do well at it. It gives him a next thing to do, but you know what else? For 30 years, he kept all of his stories under wraps. He was a character that didn't tell stories, didn't interact with the public, didn't do a lot of television, and when he didn't do a lot of talking. He has all kinds of stories built up between his time in the 90s, pre-WWF, throughout his early run, into like the Ministry of Darkness, into the American Badass, all the way through the 2000s into the 2010s, that people aren't talking about and didn't tell because they were his stories to tell.
And he's such a fountain of knowledge and information about wrestling, and to sit down and pick his brain, everybody would love to do that, even people who are more mainstream celebrities. I'll never forget, and I don't know why this sticks out in my brain, but during one of his NBA finals, LeBron James was walking through the tunnel and he was wearing an Undertaker t-shirt.
And it makes sense because Undertaker is a transcendent athlete. He's up there with every other professional wrestler.
You started to say a word and I thought you were going to say a different word.
I'm sorry to disappoint you.
You become one of those transcendent figures by building up the mystique, continuing to contribute to the stories.
And while he's now more Mark Calloway than Undertaker, it was massive. Even when I was growing up watching him, and that's getting now to probably around the mid-2000s, so social media was starting to become a little bit more popular and more of a thing. He still kept very private and to himself in an era that got increasingly more difficult.
You went from a time where you never saw anything of him to seeing pictures of him playing video games. Pictures of him in a bathing suit standing looking at a shark angrily. Footage of him at people's graduations. I would have loved for The Undertaker to come to my graduation.
Oh, me too.
But that was a door that was always closed and it was preserved. And they opened that up very quickly.
Well, and I think that's why he did that Last Ride documentary, which I highly, highly recommend. I think it got to a point where Taker, obviously at a certain point, he knows he's closer to the end than the beginning.
And I think that documentary was kind of a way for him to start getting comfortable being more open and being presented more as himself as opposed to The Undertaker.
And I've noticed that since he's opened up on his stories, other people have opened up more about him as well.
He has a whole career set out for him. I don't know if content creator would be the appropriate term for what he do, but people would pay to see The Undertaker and just to show up and listen to him.
Yeah, he could fill an arena at any city he went to because that's what wrestling is.
I forget what, but he presented a trophy for European soccer. Yeah, I know. That's a weird thing, but at the same time, he's The Undertaker. He presented a trophy. He could do that. Why couldn't Undertaker present a belt to the winner of college football? Because I know WWE has a partnership with them.
Oh, and everybody knows, a lot of people know him.
Yeah, you see people do the eye roll and like the tongue out with the thumb across the neck thing a lot. You see, just because I know I use sports a lot, but just because obviously sports are super mainstream, you see a lot of NBA players doing the throat slash thing. You see a lot of NBA players doing the you can't see me. Tom Brady just came out at the Fanatics Fest and did the Hulk Hogan let me hear you think. Everybody knows The Undertaker and who he is.
It's interesting though, everybody knows who he is, but they didn't know who he was for the longest time. And I don't mean like, what I mean by that is like we knew The Undertaker as Mark Calloway, this guy in all black, but you didn't know the stories. You didn't know who he was, what he was doing. Everything was cut very hush-hush.
Or came from a third party.
And even then, there wasn't a lot of it. Like, Kevin Nash was always vocal about some of the things that happened with Taker in the 90s. But, like,
Shawn Michaels didn't say a lot of stuff. Triple H didn't say a lot of stuff.
a lot of the private stories were kept private.
Foley and Austin didn't say a lot. Rock didn't say a lot. Vince didn't say a lot.
Now Foley tells stories.
But now it's more okay.
Because Taker opened the floodgate. And a great example of that is Hell in the Cell 98. And that's something that's his story, too.
Well, that's also arguably the most famous wrestling match ever.
Okay, you know when they go through the cage and they're laying in the ring?
Yeah.
And he's laying on the floor?
Yeah.
Was this after? Yeah, this is after he went through the floor. After he went through the cage. He didn't go through the floor in that one. That was the next Hell in the Cell he did with Triple H. But he's laying there on the ground and Terry Funk gets in the ring. And Taker says to Terry Funk, see if he's alive, right? Terry Funk gets down, crawls around on the ground, looks at Foley, checks on him, gets up, says to Taker, he's breathing.
Sounds like Foley.
Taker's choke slammed him out of his shoes.
I showed that video to a friend and I said to him, the only thing I'm going to tell you about this is the first one was planned, the second one wasn't. And he said, what do you mean? I'm like, just trust me.
You'll see. Apparently Foley remembers laying there and wondering, how did those shoes get there?
Yeah, because Foley just fell from 20 feet in the air, not once, but twice.
They should have stopped that and they just let it go twice.
Yeah, but you don't know then what you know now. The first one they wouldn't have stopped because that was planned. The second one, and you can tell by everyone's reaction, they all hit that ring way harder. I'm pretty sure you saw, to your point, Funk just like slide in 10 meters and check on Foley immediately.
He didn't remember doing the thumbtack spot.
He insisted on doing it though.
Apparently he's in the back area, covered in thumbtacks, and he looks up at Taker and he says, "So did we get to the thumbtack spot?"
Yes, Mick, we did.
Back to what we were saying, he's really a pioneer at telling these stories, and more people are coming forward with their Undertaker stories.
And he is kind of the last representation of there being a barrier between the wrestlers and fans, since kayfabe's basically dead. Everybody know, not that people didn't know wrestling wasn't real back in the 90s, but it was kind of more of like an open secret as opposed to now where it's just you can find any sort of backstage information anywhere.
You know what else is cool? Taker is telling stories for people that are dead. Percy Pringle and Paul Bearer. He's telling all of Paul Bearer's stories about all the pranks that Paul paid on him. He's not just telling the stories that make him look good or make him look interesting. He's telling the stories that make other people look wild too, you know?
I just don't want Taker to turn into Ric Flair. When they did that Ric Flair retirement match a couple years ago, he was terrible. It was awful. He had a heart attack in the ring, and it was just depressing. And it's like, not really for me, because it's not like I grew up with Flair, but I can understand for some people, it's like watching your hero fall. It's just sad and depressing. You're like, what are you doing here, dude?
After already being in a coma.
And God knows what he's done to his body between all the wrestling and alcohol.
How many times did Terry Funk come out of retirement and then announce he was done again and then come back again?
It got depressing at a certain point.
Yeah, like as early as the 90s when he was doing that thing with Bret Hart as part of like Wrestling with Shadows. Is that the documentary?
Yes.
Where they also talk about the screw job. That was one of those instances where he was wrestling Funk as like a last time thing. And even then there was 20 more matches after that or something like that.
Oh, listen, wrestling's a business of never say never. And again, Funk probably also went through an identity crisis.
You know what? I think the money was also different for Funk and then Taker. And the reactions were also different. But if Taker could come out, I don't see a world where Taker needs to come back. I think he should be content with telling his stories and interacting with people and living off of this thing that he built for himself.
And listen, if he wants to come back like at WrestleMania 40 and throw the occasional chokeslam, well, I'm here for that too. Like, think about it. He chokeslammed Braun Breaker. Does anybody not think Braun Breaker is the future of wrestling? No, because he's still the Undertaker, and it's kind of like a privilege to work alongside him.
Yeah, like even to bring him out for the night and give him that kind of interaction tells you you've got faith in him and you see something in him in the future.
Yeah.
So moral of the story is, Undertaker, I know you don't hear this. Nobody seems to hear this. Please don't get in a ring.
Please.
Well, at least not as a wrestler. Special guest referee, sure, why not? Every once in a while as an appearance to give a speech, but please don't wrestle.
Please don't.
We're not saying this for us, we're saying this for you.
You'll make the kids cry.
Now, the Young Bucks. Why isn't Tony Khan putting them on TV? Brian and Jim Cornette. I forget Brian's last name, but I'm impressed I remember his first name.
Brian Alvarez?
Nope, different Brian.
Fair enough.
We're talking about why they just put the titles on the Bucks, but you don't see them. Cornette was not disappointed that you don't see them, and I'm not either, but I just want to move this closer to me. It was alluded to that it was Tony that's not booking them. So probably they have X amount of dates, and they're trying not to use up all their dates, so either they have big plans for them at the end of the year, or they just don't want to show them on TV, or they used them a lot in the beginning, and they're trying to be sparse with them for the rest of the year.
I think less is more when it comes to the Bucks. Yeah, the new gimmick isn't working for me personally. I appreciate the effort. It's clearly a satire on Vince McMahon, but I like them better when they're doing this sort of OG Bullet Club stuff they were doing in the mid 2010s. I think that's a lot more in their wheelhouse.
But that's tired. The world's moved on. All the people they were in the Bullet Club with has moved on or are doing other things. They're kind of the last holdouts.
Not really. I mean, they're all still around technically if you don't want to count Cody Rhodes in that.
But the gimmicks have all changed. The people have all changed. They're all at different places in wrestling. They're the last two holding on to like 2015, 2016.
I mean, Kenny really hasn't changed, but then again, Kenny Omega was and still is the best wrestler in the world.
He's changed a little bit. He's not doing all the Bullet Club stuff. He stayed his authentic Kenny self.
Fair.
Cody has chased a new path. Styles is doing his own thing, kind of Bullet Club-ish in WWE, but it's also just, he's AJ Styles. He can do whatever he wants.
Hangman Adam Page has arguably the best feud in the company's history with Swerve.
And he's not doing anything specifically...
Bullet Clubby, yeah.
Exactly. Finn Balor is part of the Judgment Day.
Yeah, I guess the thing with the Bucks is that it's kind of hard because they are legitimately brothers, and so they want what's best for each other, but their success together is also their failure together.
And I don't think you can separate them. They're kind of like the Usos, where it's like...
You can do it for like one or two matches, but consistently, yeah, no, probably not.
Some people are just set up to be a tag team.
Well, the other problem is, though, is that they're legitimately executive vice presidents. It's hard to remove people from that position, especially people who are that pivotal into the company's foundation.
I just wanted to continue on that track of naming people that have moved on.
Yeah.
The Gorillas of Destiny, who are also members of the Bullet Club.
Yeah, they're both equally terrible, though.
The Tongans.
Yeah, they're both equally terrible.
I don't know. I like the Tongans.
Okay, I forget which one it was, but you can't not learn how to hold up a belt over your head.
I saw that.
He also messed up a low blow at Money in the Bank.
That was the one-eyed one.
Yeah, the Tongan, okay, maybe not so much Tama Tonga, but the other
Tongaloa.
one. Tongaloa, he sucks.
Okay, I should reiterate. I really like Tama Tonga. I always have. I followed him for a long time. Tongaloa is an interesting case.
Tongaloa gets by on his name, and the Gorillas of Destiny are a package. Plus, it helps in the case of the Bloodline 2.0.
So let's go back to the Bucks. Let's say you have two guys that you have to pay a lot of money to. You can't bring them out on TV by themselves. You know what I mean?
No, they'll be at the All-In pay-per-view. They're doing a Fatal 4-Way match, or a Fatal 4-Way ladder match with them, FTR, House of Black, I believe, and then one more group that's going to be announced on Dynamite.
So every time you bring them out on TV, you have to pay out both of them, and it's expensive because they're both already expensive, and it's double fees, right?
Because you're also paying for their EVP fees.
Yeah, but there's two of them. So if I bring out one wrestler who comes by himself, herself, I only got to pay one person. That's one fee. It could be average price, more expensive. For a tag team where they're both expensive independently, it's big money to bring them in.
It's hard. I don't know what you do with the Bucks. I think Tony's making the right decision by sort of keeping them off TV, because I'm sure there still is a minimum amount they have to do per year. So, who knows?
I don't see them getting good reactions anymore. It just kind of feels like people boo them, so they bring them out as heels, so it's easier to boo a heel, and maybe they can turn them into cool heels again, but...
I do expect something to happen when Kenny Omega comes back with this sort of new elite, with him, Mercedes Moné, and Kazuchika Okada, but how that looks, I don't know.
Omega's going to be doing that? When did that...
Well, I'm thinking, because Kenny's training to come back from diverticulitis. Like, he's in the ring, he's training, but between the rehab and the confidence, I don't know. I like the idea of Omega's first sort of return rivalry being with two people he's very comfortable with, even Kazuchika Okada.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming there's probably going to also need backup just because of a number standpoint.
So this brings up a good question. How much are they paying Okada just to be on TV, to press buttons and answer the phone and like show up every once in a while?
Probably a decent amount. I'm a little bit surprised Okada hasn't wrestled as much as he has. Now, I don't know if that's because Okada doesn't want to. I don't know if they were trying to build him up to be something special. But either way, I'm a little bit surprised Okada hasn't wrestled as much.
You know what? If you bring out somebody like Okada and you put him on TV every week, people get used to him.
Well, that's what makes Roman Reigns so great, right?
Right? If you only show them every once in a while, and this applies to Roman Reigns, this applies to Brock Lesnar, this applies to The Undertaker, this applies to so many talent over many generations. It's a big attraction when they come out. This is a once-a-year thing. You only see this every once in a while. Those two marshmallows, pretty deadly. Right? They're just white, puffy dudes.
All right. Yeah, I know you're not talking smack about the Pretty Deadly, the musical.
Doesn't matter. I don't like them. When you see those guys on TV, you see them every week. Sometimes they're wrestling. Sometimes they're singing. It's not exciting.
Honestly, and I love him. I think it'd be good for Cody if he took a little bit more of a step back.
Well, that's why Cody's not wrestling every week either.
No, and I think it's smart to keep your champion to pay-per-views exclusively, or PLEs as they're calling them now. I think it's good, but, let's be honest, it helps that Roman isn't there all the time. It helps Brock with his aura. It helps Undertaker with his aura. I could see the problem with babyface champions is that you can burn out your audience because of them. And so I think taking that little bit of a step back could definitely help Cody's longevity with the American Nightmare gimmick.
Let's be real. I think Punk not wrestling for the last however many months.
It's helped, yeah.
Yeah, he's on TV. He doesn't need to wrestle. Now he's starting to wrestle again. He's doing one-on-ones and getting more active. Did you say they announced Hell in the Cell for him and Bash at Berlin?
They're doing a strap match at Bash at Berlin, and then the plan is a Hell in the Cell match at Bad Blood.
I see. But they're starting to build it up, and they're starting to give him meaningful matches. If he would have just wrestled endlessly with people for that period of time from like Royal Rumble when he got injured up until August nowish, it wouldn't have been as special for him.
I want to give massive props to Drew for basically carrying that feud with Punk, though, and now that's arguably rivalry of the year.
Oh, yeah. And you know what? I saw something interesting.
What?
The Bloodline feud is about those red things. What are they called?
Ulafala.
Ulafala. Am I saying that right?
I believe so.
His feud has become about the disrespect, but it's also about that bracelet.
Yeah.
They can make feuds over inanimate objects that feel more realistic than AEW title feuds.
Well, this goes back to something we were talking about off the pod. I don't think Tony Khan's an idiot. I truly don't. I think he is a very smart businessman. I think as a booker and as a head of creative, that's when it gets more questionable. AEW is already worth more than WCW was at its peak. They're about to sign a massive TV contract with WBD. I just think that from a actual creative wrestling perspective, yes, AEW has gripes. But as far as AEW, the business goes, it's only 5 years old. It's still a baby by company standards. And look at what they've accomplished so far.
So on the topic of AEW and Tony Khan, what were you just telling me about All in Texas?
Yeah, they announced AEW All in Texas for 2025 next year. The rumored reason is because SummerSlam is apparently going to be in London next year. So I think it's a smart decision to bring it back to the States. But according to PWI Insider, and allow me to pull it up now.
That had to be purposeful from the WWE. Think about it.
WWE is more self-aware. Tony Khan said he feels like WWE is tampering with a lot of contracts, and I could see that being a thing since it's technically not illegal.
Hold on. Did they do All in Britain last year?
Yes.
They did it this year. They're doing it at Wembley too.
Yes.
So that's 2 years in a row they did it in the same month or roughly the same time period as SummerSlam.
WWE is more aware of AEW than they want to admit.
That was purposeful. That couldn't have not been purposeful.
I think they see AEW as a bigger threat internally than they'll ever admit publicly.
Somebody's having a laugh about that, so continue.
So according to PWI Insider, several AEW talents said they were really impressed and blown away by the level of attention they received this week at the All In Texas press conference. With the relationship the company has cultivated with the city of Arlington, there was a lot of press outlets at the show, including a number of local television networks for both English and Spanish-speaking outlets. One source stated that they felt this was easily the, quote, best press conference AEW has ever produced.
So they're getting good engagement, and it sounds like, well, Texas was always a wrestling state. It sounds like Texas is very happy with AEW, and that could be a possible home for them, or a secondary place that they could do a lot of business.
Kind of like what New York is to WWE.
Yeah. But even now, you don't see them doing as much in New York. They're spreading New York out there. They do Madison Square Garden, but that was more what they were in the 80s, the 90s.
They still consider it their sort of unofficial home.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because they have the office in Stanford. They're doing more internationally. They're just everywhere, anywhere, all at once.
Well, and again, though, it circles back to what I previously said, which is, yes, WWE is infinitely bigger and more profitable than AEW. That's also a company that's had a monopoly on the industry for the last 20 years. Who else was the viable number two? TNA, maybe for a very brief window, but they are so poorly mismanaged that they don't know what to do. Ring of Honor, probably a better in-ring product. Never been able to do the numbers they could.
New Japan never had the American foothold it needs. There's been no viable number 2 for 20 plus years. I grew up only knowing WWE.
It's interesting how TNA was never able to make themselves that number 2, and even now they're kind of like a number 3.
Very distant 3. However big the gap between AEW and WWE is, the gap between AEW and TNA is a canyon bigger.
All right, let's picture a graph.
Okay.
Let's picture WWE is number 1.
Right.
And TNA is number 2. AEW shoots up, takes that number 2 spot, outshoots TNA, but still can't beat WWE. So if you compare WWE, and you were saying this before, to AEW is not doing well. They're not filling big enough arenas. They're not getting big enough views. But if you compare them to TNA and what they're attempting and what they're accomplishing, it's much bigger.
It's like, does every single player who doesn't make the NHL or the NFL just completely suck, and they are just a terrible athlete and they should have given up on their dreams 10 years ago? Right?
You know, if you think about WCW versus WWE, there was always a definitive style. One was more sports entertainment, the other was more wrestling. Now it's professional wrestling, the art, the science, the show, then now together forever, whatever, right? Versus a wrestling show that's based off of indie style wrestling as opposed to necessarily wrestling.
And I find it very interesting how WWE tends to begin every single show with like a promo or some way of advancing the current story versus AEW, who begins almost every single show with just a straightforward wrestling match, whatever it may be.
I feel like I've seen them do intros with like promos as well.
Historically, yeah, they probably have, but nowhere near as much as WWE. Think about it. The last 2 shows they've kicked off with Mercedes Moné and Britt Baker both being openers. Previously, remember, MJF and Will Ospreay was the opening match.
Yeah.
I still believe, and this does matter, it's not everything. On a weekly basis, AEW does produce a better in-ring product than WWE, just purely from the wrestling standpoint. And I do think they have an infinitely deeper roster. No, not infinitely, but a deeper roster in terms of talent.
AEW?
Yes.
But that's kind of what's dragging them down, though, isn't it?
I think it's unfortunately the creative side of things, the actual storytelling. Tony Khan clearly can build a story. As I've previously mentioned, you have Swerve and Hangman, Mariah May and Tony Storm. Even MJF and Will Ospreay, or MJF and Punk, are all pretty solid to excellent stories.
Hear me out. If you have a roster full of people, you have to pay everybody.
I think that's the other issue.
So let's say you've got Collision, you've got Dynamite, you've got Ring of Honor, and that's all different rosters or like blended rosters. That's all these people that you have to be able to sell enough tickets, get enough buys, sell enough merch to be able to cover all their salaries.
And that's the other thing. That roster costs about $100 million a year, and at some point, I think Tony Khan is going to have to start making some hard decisions.
They're going to have to cut that in half. What's WWE's roster? Like, what's their budget? Do we know?
I don't know, but I also think of it like this. Their future stars like Tiffany Stratton, Braun Breaker, realistically, how much are they getting paid? Cody Rollins.
They could be making about $100,000, I think.
Maybe a little bit more than that, but I'd say this: their top guys, both males and females,
1 to 10 million each.
1 to 10 million, yeah. And then after I'd say you get out of the top 10 range, everybody else probably makes in the medium of the 6 figures.
Yeah. Like, and then there's some people that are above the 1 to 10, like a Roman Reigns is probably much higher up there.
Like Roman, Cody, Seth, Rhea, I'm thinking off the top.
Maybe a handful of people that are in the 10 to 15 million range.
Yeah, but whatever they're paying is infinitely smaller than what AEW is paying. NFL money.
And don't forget, they're filling arenas. They're selling a lot more merch. They've got all kinds of different deals going on. They don't have to fight for their spot on a TV network the same way.
And they're going to save a lot of money because of the Netflix deal. Think about it, right?
I told you what pulling an edge is, right?
What is pulling an edge?
Going from WWE to AEW and seeing all the empty arenas.
The arenas is unfortunately a bit of an issue, and Tony Khan needs to figure out a way to put more butts in seats.
Asses every 12 inches are money. Because if you get them in the door and sitting on the seat, that's money for the seat.
Yep.
Then they buy then they buy t-shirts, hats, sombreros, masks, whatever you're trying to sell in merchandising. Don't forget, at SmackDown we saw a $600 title belt.
Oh my God.
We saw lots of people walking around with belts they just bought, didn't we?
Yeah.
Like, I compulsively thought about buying one, and I had to, like, really prevent myself from buying a title belt that day, and I'm really glad I didn't buy one.
I'm really glad too. You were itching hard.
Oh, I was really itching for a title belt. But what I'm saying is all that stuff isn't, all of that is income. Granted, you have to pay for it to be able to sell it, so it's not 100% profit. But if you can't get those asses in the seats, you're not going to get them buying all the extras.
No, and that is unfortunately the big issue. And I just repeat this point. The company is only 5 years old. It's still a baby. Even when WCW was at its peak, it was what, 15 years old?
15, 20 years old. It had a few owners. But
if you're going to constantly compare AEW to WWE, then you are going to be consistently disappointed. That's like if I consistently compare myself to like Channing Tatum.
So what should they do differently? Fill smaller venues?
I think the smaller venues is a good place to start. I think it would honestly help if Tony Khan would give creative duties to someone else. You and I have talked about maybe Bryan Danielson filling that role.
I think that's the right person.
But I also think it's hard to ask the owner and the president and the CEO and the head of creative to give up that responsibility.
If they have their roster, I think the Bucks not being on TV and not being on their roster at all could save them a lot of money. If they have their roster, if they use smaller venues, if they up their marketing.
Well, and that's the big thing.
Those three things together and they change how they were spending their money. Those would be the things that would take them to the next level and allow them to go back to bigger venues. But I would keep it in smaller venues to start.
When I was doing my radio broadcasting program, one of the best things my professor said is play the hits. Play what people care about. And I'm going to slightly translate that to this. You have to make stars who get me to a TV. Cody Rhodes gets me to a TV. Roman Reigns gets me to a TV. I'll even broaden it. Conor McGregor, Patrick Mahomes, Muhammad Ali. They are all mega stars and they all got me to a TV.
Does Maxwell Jacob Friedman get you to a TV?
I do like Maxwell Jacob Friedman a lot, but unfortunately he's not that transcendent star. He does do like interviews and stuff, but unfortunately I still feel like he's trying to break through to that mainstream glass ceiling.
Osprey doesn't get me to a TV. When I watch him, he's interesting, but I don't care. Omega sometimes got me to a TV. The Bucks certainly don't get me to a television.
They don't have a needle mover. Where's your Conor McGregor? Where's your Cody Rhodes? Where's your Muhammad Ali?
And everybody that moves needles goes there and then leaves.
And that's very true, unfortunately. Not everybody, I would say, because apparently those contracts are actually better than WWE's. They pay more for less dates. But I think some of it also stems from because it's so new, it's a lot more of a chaotic company. And so you look at someone like Jay Cargill and she's like, I love AEW, but I left because I needed to go to a place that's a little bit more stable.
You know, I watch Dynamite every week when Edge was on TV. Adam Copeland, Edge, whatever the fuck you want to call him.
It goes by both.
Christian doesn't move that needle for me.
Really?
Yeah, I like him with Edge. On his own, he's just making fun of people without dads and talking shit about people's dads, and it's like, thank you. We know you're everyone's dad, but you're not everyone's dad.
The point I'm trying to make, though, is that Tony Khan can't build stars. And that's what I'm kind of hoping he ends up doing with Mariah May. He's almost there with MJF. I think you should be a little bit nicer to Will Ospreay. We did see him perform live. He's the best wrestler in the world. And when you have the best anything in the world, that is something.
I thought the Great Khali was the best wrestler in the world.
I'm extremely sorry to disappoint you.
So let's go back to that comparison. They shouldn't be compared to each other. One's a major league, one's somewhere in the middle. But they both actively compare themselves to each other and compete with each other. So they're drawing each other into that same wheelhouse, even if they're not meant to be or if they're not compatible. So they really need to figure out how to separate themselves from each other, and that means something like not booking SummerSlam in Britain when you know they're going to do All In the same month and kill that town for them. That means not referencing their people. You know, TNA, when you come over to TNA, you're just there, everyone knows you, they don't milk you that hard for your past. They're constantly referencing each other, taking each other's talent. If they could be separate entities, it would be a lot better that way. So that's another episode. We want to thank you for listening and follow, subscribe. See you next time.